Snow took her footprints as if she had never been. The white field behind the house was a blank ledger under the moon, and every dragged step erased another account of where she'd been. One more erasure between the door she had slammed and the road she chose. Clara Whitmore moved on knees and then on feet, coatless, a torn shawl wrapped tight at her throat, a thin trickle of blood gone cold along her cheek. The cold tasted metallic when she breathed. The wind pushed at her ribs like a hand trying to force her back. She had run past the lamp that had shattered against the wall. She had run leaving a chair overturned and the echo of a man's voice angry enough to crack the silence into pieces. She had run with a single worn revolver tucked beneath her skirts and a locket that felt too heavy for one with a life to sever. Every time she wanted to stop, she remembered Hank Blackwell's hand at her hair, remembered the way he had said things in front of others to make her smaller, how a man's influence in town could be a law of its own. That thought sharpened her pace. At the ridge, where the land bowed toward the river and the trees thinned, a sound like hooves broke the hush. Clara pressed herself against the lee of a sagebrush and tried to make the world hold its breath. She had 7 years of silence to run from. Tonight there were only hours, and the crack of a boot on a porch board, and the knowledge he would not give up the game until he'd dragged her back, or worse. A pair of hooves came closer, steady, patient, not the furious gallop of a hunting animal, but the measured tread of a rider scanning the dark. The horse paused and snorted, frost clouded from its nostrils in a pale plume. Clara, who had been taught survival by taxes and cold and the hard eye of the frontier, counted seconds and wondered how long until a shadow leaned down the path, searching for a woman with a torn shawl and a face she wished not to show. The rider lowered the reins. He sat tall in the saddle, with a coat pulled up against the wind, a hat pulled low, and a scarf white with snow. A shape at the far edge of the road, at first a silhouette, then a man whose face was the kind you did not see much in town, the corded jaw of a man who had worked with beasts and land and years. His horse pawed the ground, restless. For a breath, Clara thought to stay entirely still and let the rider pass. He didn't pass. The horse stopped a dozen yards away, and the man squinted at her, as if trying to read a name in a bruise. He nudged the animal to the side, eased down until he stood with his boots sunk into snow, and the horse's flank steaming like a small white cloud. Up close, the man's eyes were gray and worn with some private sorrow. His left cheek bore a scar, a pale line like a seam running near his mouth. "Miss?" His voice was low and travel-worn, not the easy drawl of a town bully. "You all right out here?" Clara kept her hand hidden on the revolver under her skirt.
She had learned, painfully, not to trust a voice, even if it was kind. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice cracked like thin glass, just passing through. Not with blood there. He tilted his head toward the wet line on her cheek. Not tonight. She wanted to shrink from a pity that would anchor her back into Hank's reach. She was not a thing anyone could recollect and corral. She was the author of the decision to leave. Still, there was a rational part of her that measured degrees of threat. A lone rider on a single horse, no lanterns behind him, no town light. If it meant the difference between staying alive or not, it was a necessary gamble. The man removed his gloves and stepped forward with slow, deliberate hands. He carried a wool coat slung across one arm, offered without theatricality. "Take this," he said. "You'll freeze otherwise." Her instincts made her decline. Any kindness in a stranger was a risk in this country. Some came with strings. Hank could have sent a man. Hank paid hands to find a woman who wanted to be hidden. She looked at the coat. Heavy, patched at the sleeve, warm smelling of horses and saddle. A life wrapped in it. She thought then of her mother's voice, and the one time she'd let someone hold her hand as a child, how that had felt like safety. Then she thought of the lamp, the chair, the smashed glass, and the man calling her name with a thirst for ownership. Her fingers tightened on the gun. "I don't take favors," she said, voice a brittle thinness that felt like it might crack into fear. "You don't have to." He stepped back a foot and lowered his head, not offended. "Name's Cool Rourke. I'm taking this road toward Fort Benton. If you want to ride, you can. If not, I'll leave you to your work." Clara considered the ride. Fort Benton meant riverboats, then perhaps passage north where a woman without a name could be less known. It meant paperwork she didn't have, a river steamship schedule she'd only heard of from the market. It meant leaving a life so thoroughly that there'd be no way back without telling the whole town the truth she had kept in the dark. It meant letting a stranger see her soul through its bruises.
She looked at him. There was something in his face that told her he had seen too much to be gullible. Also, he had not asked where she came from. He had not pressed. That made a small difference. "All right," she said. She loosened the revolver and slid it into a pocket beneath her skirts, letting her hand fall empty to the snow. "You keep it," he said. "No one touches it." He settled her on the horse behind him with the practicality of a man who had set men over pack horses and who knew the balance of weight and rhythm. The animal's back rose under her, steady, and Clara wrapped herself in the stranger's coat. For the first time that night, she felt warmth that was not a heat of fear. The coat smelled faintly of tobacco and leather, and something that could be a man's life. Hands that had held ropes, a long trail of loneliness. They rode in silence for a long stretch, the sky a hard dome overhead, stars sharp like thrown nails. Clara watched the moonlight make the snow into glass. Her mind moved through a list of small things to do if she reached Fort Benton. Find a boarding house, speak to a woman who could put her name in a ledger as a lodger, find passage. She thought of showing her cheek and saying the words that would start the machine of law. Police, sheriff, excuses. Words that might or might not mean shelter. The thought of Hank in the same room with a sheriff made her stomach twist. After a mile or two, the rider spoke as if testing the sound of his voice. "If you'd rather walk, I can leave you at the bend. There's a stand of pines." He didn't sound like a man who would leave her anyway. No, she didn't want the pines. She wanted to keep moving toward places where names and forms mattered, where men wore a badge or at least carried a ledger. She wanted to be somewhere that counted her as a person who could be served with a kind of protection. "You're not the first woman I've brought in," Rourke said after a time, as if to fill the small night between them with a fact that might explain him. "Won't be the last either." Clara's jaw tightened. "Why would you do that?" He rubbed his palm over Rusty's flank. Rusty was the horse's name, she realized then when he spoke it as if the animal was another thought, not just a mount. "I had a sister once," he said. The words landed like something heavy. He did not elaborate. He only kept the sentence as a tether. "She didn't make it. I wasn't there when." Clara felt in that small admission the reason for his intervention. The previous feeling of a stranger's kindness acquired an outline. People could act like shepherds out of guilt or conviction. Either way, when it mattered, a man who had lost someone might chase another chance to be right. That didn't make him safer, but it gave him a reason that wasn't curiosity or profit. They rode until the skeleton of the farmhouse disappeared behind a hill, and the road sank into a shallow valley. The wind settled into them, a band of cold like someone tightening a belt. Cole guided Rusty off the path and into a thicket that sheltered them from the wind. By the time Rusty's hooves found the snow dark beneath pine needles, Clara's fingers were numb enough she could scarcely close her fist. Cole tipped his hat and moved with a small, brisk efficiency that contained no theatrics. A tin cup, a slab of hard bread, a canteen of water that steamed with warmth. The man seemed made of small preparations. He carried a lantern whose glass had a spider web of hairline cracks, but its light was steady and amber, a little sun in the dark. "You can leave me here," Clara said, thinking to make herself smaller again. "I'll warm up."
"I can get to the ford on foot when it's light." Cole set the cup between two rocks and unslung a small leather roll. "There's a cabin half a mile in," he said. "Shelter's a better idea. You're walking on frost now that'll bite at your fingers. Come on." She considered that, hesitated, then let herself be convinced by the quietness in his voice. Not coercion, not rushing, but the same practical insistence that comes from someone who knows weather. She let him take her elbow and lead her through the underbrush toward a squat silhouette of a cabin with smoke already rising from the chimney. Someone had been there within the past day. The place smelled like broth and wood smoke, like a civilized lie against the wild. Inside, the cabin was small and spare. A table with a bench, a bed with a feather tick, a wood stove that hummed with a kind of restrained heat. On a peg by the door hung a box of matches, a kerosene lamp, and a stack of folded woolen shirts. The man set Clara by the stove and moved with careful hands, removing her shawl, loosening the collar, tucking his own coat across her shoulders. He fetched a basin and warmed some water over the coals, careful not to scald. "You'll need to warm slow," he said. "If you bring blood that cold back too quick, it'll do worse than the cold." Clara's hand went to the cut at her cheek, and she looked at him, startled that he'd mentioned it in such ordinary terms. He had the air of someone for whom wounds were a thing to be managed, a fact of life, not a show. He cleaned the cut with deliberate motions,
pressing a cloth with hand that balanced gentleness and competence. He never asked how it happened. He treated the blood like an object of business, not a confession. She offered guarded answers instead. Name's Clara Whitmore. I was married to Hank Blackwell. We had a house out by the northern road. Whitmore, he said, rolling the name as if he were assessing it. Blackwell's name carries in that valley. I know it. She flinched. You do? He looked at her levelly. Everyone knows who owns what. He set the cloth aside. You did right to leave. She almost laughed at that, a brittle thing. If I'd known what right meant, I'd have learned sooner. He took a seat opposite her by the table and made a small offering of bread. It was not charity. It was a gesture that conveyed a simple human economy of care. They ate in a kind of cautious truce. Outside the window, the world was white and indifferent. In here, the stove hummed and threw a soft orange across their faces. When Clara tried to sleep, she found sleep had a hard time trusting warmth. She sat on the bed and wrapped the coat tighter. Cole moved quietly to the stove and then paused, as if listening to a memory. My sister, he said again, this time with a small tilt that could be either apology or explanation. She ran from a man who swore to keep her. He found her in a boarding house, and he left her there when he was done.
She never got up again. Clara listened like a woman who had been taught to pick through the bones of words for the marrow. Cole didn't say the details. He didn't explain what he had felt at the time. He only let that old grief sit between them like an extra blanket. It said something, that he had learned how much it cost to be absent, and how much it could cost to show up. You came because of her? She asked. A part of me did, he admitted. A larger part did it because I couldn't leave a woman out in the snow. If you go out there tonight, wolves will eat at the thin things. They're not picky. He gave her a half grin that was nothing like the grin of a flirt. Also, I don't like the idea of a man turning his back on another man's shame. There was the small, sharp flash of humor you sometimes find on the frontier. People make code where legal systems fail. Clara felt a looseness in her chest, a tiny uncoiling. To be treated like a person with reasons rather than a thing to be hidden. These were the first honest breaths she'd had in hours. She told him, haltingly, the parts she wanted to tell. The door slammed, the lamp, the words that were not all spoken, but that filled a room with a shape. She left out other things, because some truths had to be kept as raw meat until they stopped hurting. She did not tell him the first time, years ago, when Hank's words had been small and then not. She only told him what pushed her out the door this night. You could go to the sheriff in Fort Benton, Cole said eventually, after she had said enough to make her tired. He's Wade Turner. He's not the kind to bend for a man's friend. You'd be safer there than in a house where a man thinks the law benja pounder him. How do you know that? I met him once at a trading post. He spoke plain. Cole's mouth lifted into a private memory. You can't buy Sheriff Turner's conscience with liquor. Clara laughed then, a small sound like ice cracking. That's a comfort I never expected to meet. You got choices, he said, and you'll need money. It's not free to ride a riverboat out of here. You're not the first to try crossing. The economy of choices, a ledger that had to be balanced with coin and route, settled over their talk. Clara sorted through the list. Get to Fort Benton, find the sheriff, make a plan for a steamer to Canada, get legal cover, find a place where Hank's name didn't have the purchase it did back home. Fort Benton promised a steamer called Morning Star. She had heard of it in passing, a vessel that ran when the river loosened. It was a hope measured in possible delays. The river thawed with spring, and the timetable moved in weeks rather than hours. Cole listened, and then did what he always did, organized what he could. He counted out small needs. An extra pair of mittens he had in a saddlebag, 2 blankets he said he could spare.
He pressed a folded note of a map into the table. He'd made marks there, lines that showed the safer tracks to ride toward the Benton Road, and away from the valley where Hank's men might be better acquainted with passes and shortcuts. Clara accepted the mittens and the blanket and let herself be practical for the time being. She had to be. The night was a teacher of the small, and she had sat many lessons long. In the morning, the sky was a thin silver, and the breath of the horse made little ghosts against the light. Frost widened the cabin roof like sugar. Cole's routine of preparation was quiet and efficient. He checked the saddle, wrapped Clara's injuries with fresh cloths, warmed broth, and provided shoes for her that were 2 sizes too big, but better than nothing. He helped her onto Rusty, who seemed to take to her like an animal that understood need. You might need to say your name once on the road, Cole said, steadying her. Folks here will ask, Say Whitmore, and don't let any man make it smaller than it is." Clara looked at him with a complex of gratitude that had, in just a few hours, the depth of a new trust. She was suspicious by habit, but not by nature. When someone gave the gifts of care and didn't demand a price in stories told or shame returned, she felt something akin to relief. They left the cabin and rode along a narrow track, trees pressure firm at their flanks, sun cold as a coin. They rode light and with purpose toward the river road and Fort Benton, a goal that was a name and a plan and a distance measured in days rather than hours. Sleep tempted them on the ridge. Cole's voice kept bringing them back into a rhythm with instructions and small observations. They traveled by lines of trees that sheltered from the wind, by coulees that offered little pockets of calm. The landscape was a slow geography of survival. When hunger struck them, they made a quick meal. When Clara's fingers threatened to go numb, Cole had mittens to tuck them into. The days were a study in quiet endurance and small confidences. They spoke little of all the things that were dangerous to name. Instead, they traded details that filled time. Cole's hands were calloused from horses and ropes. He knew leather the way some men knew scripture. Clara spoke of small pleasures: biscuits she used to drop into her son's lap when he was small, a garden she had once tended before the house turned into something else. She said little about the years of marriage's slow erosion, but the mention of her son, Ella, because she'd never had a boy, made the lines at her mouth soften. On the second afternoon, a new scent crept into the cold like a warning. Smoke not from their own fires, but from a different flame. Cole stiffened, listening with the attention of a man whose life had been measured by the noise of others. He had a tracker's eye, the sort that marked where a boot had scuffed, where a horse had left a divot. He slowed Rusty to a walk and put a finger to his lips.
They followed a shallow ravine and found tracks. 2 horses had passed not long before them. The prints were deep and close together. The hoof marks told a story in the grammar of a rider's weight. Cole crouched and brushed away the top of a print, then sniffed at the salted rim. "Not local," he said. "Different tack, different gait. Hired riders." Clara's stomach dropped like a stone. She had not wanted the night to make its way to them in such a known manner. Hank could not find every road, but he could pay for men to do what he could not, take advantage of a trail's weakness. The presence of trackers meant Hank had time and resources and a reach beyond the small house where he'd tried to make a woman into a thing. "We can cut deeper into the Badlands," Cole said. "We can try the South Trail. It'll slow them." "We're not running forever," Clara said. The set of her mouth showed that the choice to run had not been an exercise in moving away from Hank, but toward an end she had not yet named. "We're not," Cole agreed. "We take them where we need to." He fitted his hand along the saddle horn like the simple act steadied his plans. "We go after Fort Benton, and there we see Sheriff Turner. That's the plan." They followed the South Trail, a less worn track that veered through a stand of cottonwoods. For a time the land swallowed human noise, and only the wind spoke. By nightfall the sense of being tracked did not fade. Claire lay awake with the gun beneath her pillow. Every minute a small tautness of fear wrapped around her chest and refused to yield. On the 3rd day, while a low cloud flattened the light and made shadows run together, they encountered signs that the hired hands were closer. Someone had been there the night before, a wrapper of cloths caught in a bush, a smear of tobacco half burned on a rock. Cole read each without ceremony and corded his calm around it. "They're scouts," he said. "Not the men who'd hold you on the street, but the ones who find where a horse's hooves have friendlier soil. They'll try to circle." "How many?" Clara asked. "Doesn't matter." He looked at her with an honesty that neither minimized nor overstated the threat. "Enough to make a fight ugly." Clara's fingers tightened on the revolver across her belly. "I can shoot," she said. "I can hold it." He met her gaze. There was no patronizing there. "If it's your life, you will do whatever you must." She swallowed. The idea of killing another person, of using the gun for what it was made to do, weighed on her like a possible second sin. Yet the frontier measured deeds in survival and not in moral absolutes. Sometimes the counting was the only arithmetic that mattered. "Then teach me to watch," she said. He taught her a way to listen to snow, a way to see in tracks what the eye might miss, the spacing of a tread, the way a rider holds a rein when expecting a fight, the scent of smoke that indicated a man had been there and had a purpose. She learned to read a landscape that had wanted, until that week, only her obedience. Now it became a book with sentences she could learn to parse. They moved more carefully after that, making the trail difficult to follow. They doubled tracks by walking a compass arc. They wasted distance and wore Rusty down, because the lesson of the country was often the long and the tedious.
Ultimately, that was how a hunter lost the trail, through imprecision and impatience. Cole taught her patience as if it were a craft. On the fourth day, as the river valley widened and the promise of Fort Benton moved from rumor to visible sign, smoke from a far sawmill, a string of low buildings along the river, Clara allowed herself a small flicker of hope. There was a dock in the distance and a sentry's movement that could be seen as indifferent to a single woman's arrival. The town had its own life to be busy with. In such a place, names meant less than they did on the narrow road in the valley. They were 3 miles from the town when Clay, a wordless thing that meant luck, turned against them. A tuft of dry grass moved off the trail, and then the low crack of a twig gave them away. The horse across the coulee snorted and took the scent of strangers. From behind a rise came a whisper, the faint, drawn-out cry of a man signaling a find. Cole's jaw went hard. He had a way of moving that made Clara realize how different the world looked when someone decided to fight for you. He spurred Rusty into a low, fast gait, and her hand went instinctively to the grip at her hip. She felt the metal there, and the thought of pulling it out was both a comfort and a burden. A gun was a promise, and a terrifying one at that. They rode the next 3 minutes with a narrowness that made every sound into a potential danger. Snow flew from the horse's hooves, and the air between them and the coulee seemed to be a thin membrane that might become violence. When they crested the rise, they saw 3 men, coats patched, faces mostly hidden beneath caps, one with a rifle angled in the crook of his arm. They had the look of riders hired for pay, men who would take a day's need for a night's gain. They had the look of people whose moral calculus allowed for a crookedness when profit walked past. One of them shouted a challenge. The man's voice cracked slightly with the cold and with the excitement. "There she is, Blackwell's gal." Clara's face flamed with a sudden cold shame that had nothing to do with guilt. She did not want men to be able to locate the private parts of her life by calling her name. Her body tightened into a shape of resistance. Cole did not speak. He sat Rusty in a line with the earth and let the horse run. The men fired, small crack, the kind of sound that stung without meaning to be final, and one leaden bale of a bullet scraped a branch above them. The men meant business, but not death. They meant wind and threat and acclaim. Cole angled Rusty left, away from the riders, and toward a narrow arroyo that would discourage pursuit. He rode like a practiced man, and Clara felt herself hang to his back like a sparrow to a branch. The glare of the world shrank to a few motions: the pull of the reins, the clack of a boot on a stirrup, the grit of snow in the mouth. When they pushed into the arroyo, the slope gave them a brief shelter. Cole dismounted and set the rifle on a boulder, his hands working with the calm of someone used to the pressure of being responsible. "You're hurt?" he asked. "Not more than I was." Her voice shook, but the cold had sharpened the edges of endurance. "They were scouts." He nodded. "You stay down. I'll see which way they went." He crept to the lip of the arroyo and peered over. Clara watched him as if she were seeing him for the first time, not as a stranger who had given her a coat, but as a man whose life had accepted the line of responsibility without asking for its shape. He could have left. He could have ridden to the town and let the law be the law. He did not. They lay low as the wind hammered the land. Snow became a curtain that made distance meaningless. When the voices faded, Clara felt a small victory that was as unsentimental as the way a hand warms inside a glove. They had not been captured, and they had not been seen. The relief was dampened by the knowledge of why those men had been there. Hank Blackwell had money and teeth and a tendency to use both. Cole returned and sat with her, breathing slowly. "We'll go into Benton from the west," he whispered. "Less likely they'll look there." "You sure?" Her voice was thin. "No," he said, "but it's the best direction." She liked that answer. It was not a promise of victory, only a careful plan. That night they camped with more fire and a lighter hunger. Cole kept watch as if the act of waiting could make a person less alone. Clara slept on and off, buoyed by a sense that for the first time since the lamp had smashed, someone else's watch was on her name. That watch did not own her. It protected her as she had asked to be protected. In the morning there was a familiar ache in Clara's fingers where the frost had begun to claim them. Cole made a poultice, a simple mixture of heated cloth and hot water, wrapped her hands and told stories of a sister who had liked to dance by riverboats. He spoke of small things as if this would be a balm. There were lessons in the way he tended the body that felt like a map of kindness. They reached the edge of the town by the light of a shop dawn. Fort Benton lay along the river's bank like a line of trusted promises: boats, warehouses, a courthouse with a porch, and people who seemed to be going about business with the sort of indifferent efficiency cities had that the countryside did not. Clara felt a lift in her chest in spite of the weariness. The town had both the impersonal world that might shelter and the instruments that might protect. Cole guided Rusty to a livery and hitched him out of sight of the main street.
He walked her through a meandering set of alleys till they came to a boarding house with a small brass bell at the door, and a woman whose face was lined with a kind of practical hardness. The landlady took Clara's story in a look and offered a cot for the night with a curt that carried no judgment. It was small mercies all the way down the path. "You're safe enough," Cole told her. He took steps back like a man giving her space. "I'll find Sheriff Turner tomorrow." "You're leaving?" Clara's voice had an ache that was more complicated than mere gratitude. The idea of parting from someone who had been a pillow of safety made her chest contract. "I need to settle some things," he said. "Rusty needs rest. I have a debt I should pay off. Also, I'll put money by so you can get aboard the Morning Star when she's ready." She searched his face and saw in it a depth that had the weight of a promise rather than a command. He had not asked for anything. No oath, no gratitude beyond what a human owed another for the simple act of life. It made her feel less like a thing to be salvaged, and more like a person who might still be loved on terms agreeable to her. "You don't have to go," she said. He smiled then, like one who had expected that reply. "I do," he said. "I have ghosts to settle, but I'm not leaving you to the town alone. Sheriff Turner's an honest man. He'll watch until you can get away." She stepped forward and took him by the sleeve. The touch was short and careful. "Thank you," she said. More than thanks, it was a confession. Small perhaps to the world, but vast within her chest. He cleared his throat. "You keep your gun," he said, with the firm tone of giving someone back a thing important. "Keep it loaded, and don't let any man make you smaller." She nodded. "I won't." They stood an extra beat, the cold around them sharp, and then Cole turned and walked away. Rusty's bell jingled in his stride. Clara watched him go as if he were a small weather system moving off the horizon, necessary and real and transient. Inside the boarding house, she cleaned the small wounds on her hands and wrapped them with more care than she had given most of her life. The landlady, Mrs. Ellen Moore, moved like a person who had watched sorrow and knew how to allocate patches of kindness. She spoke in a low voice about beds by the window and about which windows were better for one who needed to leave at dawn. She was practical and unromantic, and it suited Clara like a pair of good shoes. Later that afternoon, when the sun made a wafer of itself against the water, 2 riders came into town like a shadow sliding across the face of the world. They brought with them a talk full of the outskirts gossip, and someone named Hank Blackwell was mentioned, then not mentioned again, as if the name had a weight that made people look away. Clara's hands tightened around the rim of her cup, and her breath hitched. For a moment, the town seemed too small to contain all the eyes that could fall on her. Cole did not return that evening. He had said he'd be back, and she expected him with the same childlike hope she had not shown in years. The night thickened. Clara sat by the window and watched the river make slow columns along the shore. She had to choose now, more than ever, how to speak the next chapter of her life. When the door opened, she did not need the light to recognize him. He moved across the room like a man who had been to the edge and found a way back, his boots speaking in the hush like a person who had been careful with his steps. The smell of travel clung to him, saddle leather, a little smoke, the musk of a horse. He shut the door behind him and let the lock click with the finality of a man who wanted to make sure the outside world understood a line had been drawn. "You looked for me?" he asked. "I watched," she corrected. "Is that worse?" He leaned against the frame. "No." He held up a folded envelope and a coin. $40. That should be enough for a berth when Morning Star's ready and a small passage fee toward your start. Clara looked at the money like someone who had learned to measure hope in coins. "You shouldn't have. You would have done it for another woman," he said simply. "This is what I can do." She opened her mouth and found words that were closer to life than the ones she'd carried through the snow. "Why?" she asked. His face folded into a map of restraint and sorrow. "My sister," he said again, but he put a finger to his lips. "I don't need to say more. Just don't make me regret it." Clara let out a breath that had been sitting between her teeth like a lodged bone. She had not expected gratitude to be awkward. She had not expected gratitude to be a thing that might make a man feel like he'd staked some part of his past on her future. "Where will you go?" she asked at last. He looked away, out the window, toward the river. "There's a trail to the north that's likely safe. I'll check on some debts. I'll see these men who followed you and make sure they know they're not worth the sort of trouble Hank likes to buy. Promise?" He touched her shoulder with a small, quick movement. "I'll be back before the boat's ready." She nodded, but the nod had an emptiness that made the space in her chest ache. The house settled with the night.
Somewhere beyond the town, men closed in and made a plan. In the silence, Clara placed her revolver on the table and laid her hand over it like a prayer that was not a prayer. The gun meant something now besides fear. It meant the last line of agency she refused to cede. She wrapped her fingers around its handle as if it were a pledge to herself, not an instrument of vengeance. Outside, the river glimmered under the moon, a steady, indifferent current that carried with it the seasons.
Inside, a woman who had fled a violent marriage set small traps for hope and arranged her life around a coming dawn. There would be more to do, more eyes to watch, more men to dodge, more papers to sign. But for this night, she had a place to rest. Beyond town, in the scrub and between ridges, other riders set their faces toward the river. Tracks in fresh snow showed the arc of their approach. They meant to find what was promised them. Up on a bluff, two figures paused to study the layout of Fort Benton, their breath rising in thin fog. One of them spat a wad of tobacco and pushed a cap back from his face. "You see her yet?" he asked the other. "Not yet," came the reply. "But word's been good. Blackwell don't like being left to the cold for long." They rode on, and the moon kept watch like a white witness. Inside the boarding house, Clara lit a small candle and watched the flame like a small border between everything she'd left and everything that might still take her. She was not naive enough to think the night ended here. The tracks in the snow outside the town told a truth she could not avoid. The tracks in the snow outside the town told a truth she could not avoid. If you like survival stories set in the Old West, hit like and tell us where you're watching from. The next morning, the town felt smaller than before, its streets narrower to Clara's eye, as if Fort Benton itself had leaned in to listen. The river's edge glinted with a hard, low sun, and men in fur hats moved with a purposeful indifference that suited markets and trade. Yet under the ordinary motion, other currents threaded. A rumor carried on a butcher's laugh, the sideways glance of a man unloading bales, the way a stable lad kept an eye on every woman who asked for a berth. Clara slept in long, shallow stretches that night, and woke with the residue of fear sitting like a stone in her chest. She dressed with the care of someone who knew that each button and fold could mean the difference between being seen and being invisible. She wrapped Cole's coat about her shoulders and tucked the revolver beneath the folds as she'd been taught. The landlady, Mrs. Ellen Moore, moved like quiet machinery around her, bringing broth and pointing out the best time to slip down to the wharf. "You can go meet the sheriff after the noon bell," Ellen said, in the way of people who really meant help. "He's not the sort to be rushed at the door. He takes statements proper in daylight." When Clara arrived at the courthouse a little later, she found Sheriff Wade Turner sitting behind a table scarred by ledger marks and tobacco rings. He was a man whose face wore the plainness of someone who'd seen too many claims to feel amazed. His hands were large, and his eyes held the slow, steady clearness of a man who preferred to count facts rather than outrun the truth with talk. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising and offering a seat. His voice was steady and not the sort that tried to soothe. He respected facts more than feelings. "You do well to come in daylight." She told him the story she could tell, the lamp, the hand at her hair, the leaving. She spoke the night into facts, and the facts were small and precise. She showed the smear of blood along her cheek and the bruise shadowing the jaw. The sheriff listened and jotted down words, not in a way to trap her, but to preserve what could be used if need be. "Mr. Blackwell's name carries," he said finally, folding the paper with a deliberate motion. "Folks know him in that valley. He's got friends, and he's paid for men before. I won't lie to you. Law in a place like this can be slow, and it can bend if men with coin make it hungry. But I can do this for you now. I can hold him if he comes in here, and we have cause to detain him. I can ask for witnesses. I can keep you in a place where a man's hands don't find you." "How long?" Clara asked, the question immediate and brittle. How long until the law did what it was asked? "It depends on what we can prove and who we can find to speak. I can hold him on assault and malicious wounding and attempt." He checked himself and softened. "I can hold him for assault and a dangerous disturbance if we can show probable cause. It buys time so you can travel. It does not fix everything. It is a rope to grab, not a promise that you'll never be touched again." She nodded. The answer was not a shield, but it was something like a hinge. She felt her chest relax a fraction. "It will be enough,"
she said, for now. Wade Turner's next moves were the kind small acts are made of. He sent deputies to speak with men who'd been in the valley. He logged her statement in the sheriff's book, an old ledger that smelled faintly of ink and river, and he arranged for a quiet room in a warden's house near the docks under the nominal care of Mrs. Ruth Calder, who kept lodgings for those who needed a hand. Ruth had eyes like a person who'd paid her price of watches and had learned how to be useful. "You'll be under watch," Turner said, leaning forward as if to aim his words. "You go on the Morning Star when she's ready. I can't promise the whole world will stop looking, but I can hold any man who tries to drag you back while she's in port." Clara left the sheriff's office with a sense of cautious planning in her bones. It was not joy, it was not peace. It was a map with a line on it, and lines in the country were better than nothing. On the wharf she found Cole waiting, his coat dusted with snow and his hands raw from work. Rusty stood near the livery, shagged with winter hair, patient as a truth. "You found him?" Clara asked. "Left a few men where they shouldn't be," Cole said with a half grin that hid worry. "Made sure they'd think twice before following a woman into town. Sheriff Turner wanted to see you and I. Well, I gave him what I knew. He'll hold men if he's got cause."
"You did what you said you'd do," Clara answered. The not-parting feeling from the cabin had returned in a different shape. Gratitude without debt. Trust without shackles. Cole hesitated, looking at her as if weighing something. "There's still the matter of Hank himself," he said. "If he comes in with a mind to make things ugly, he's a man used to having his way. I'll be around until you're on that steamer." "I don't want you to throw yourself at him," she said. "I want him stopped the right way." "He won't be stopped unless someone stops him." The edge in his voice was quiet but clear. "You'll have your say, Whitmore. I only make sure you get to say it." Days stretched, measured by the morning bell and the hours the Morning Star might break an icebound schedule. Winter in the valley was not yet done. The river still held small sheets of glassed-over ice, and the captain's word was cautious. Captain Brooks came down from his steamer now and then to check the manifest, a large man with a face like a quarry, and a manner that softened only at the edges for good crew and fair rules. "You got a berth, Miss Whitmore," he told her one morning, hands like coiled rope. "But she don't move until she can, and she don't take passengers who can't pay. That's common sense. You got coin?" Cole had already left a folded reason with the captain, $40 in a sealed envelope he pressed into Clara's palm when he visited her at Ruth Calder's lodging. The captain glanced at it, and then at Clara. There was a closed, assessing look that told her the world was still a place where coin mattered. "You'll travel light," Brooks said, "and you'll listen to the pilot when he tells you to move. Rivers have moods." There were small pleasures to be had in waiting, a warm bowl, a sunlit step where Clara could sit and feel a heat that belonged to her alone, a barber who traded a bowl of hair and a smile. Cole would come and go. Sometimes he arrived with news of a man who'd been paid to stand down. Sometimes he came with a bruise earned in a back alley, something he traded for someone else's silence. He told her little, precisely because his not telling had the same weight as confession. He protected her by making his own life a safer map. One afternoon, the town's hush broke like thin ice under a sudden footfall. Men came into Fort Benton on purpose this time, not riding quietly like the previous scouts, but with an arrogant town-bred swagger that made them take up space. Rumors spread fast like soap bubbles. Hank Blackwell was in town. He'd come with a lawyer's cousin and two men who looked like they'd been paid to keep trouble from turning on them. The names trailed behind them like a harness. Clara's stomach folded inward. She had been building a life in small steps. A coat, money, the sheriff's word. Hank's presence made all of it precarious. She tightened the hand around the revolver beneath her skirts and stayed as quiet as a thought. She did not intend a spectacle. She intended to be practical. So when Mrs. Ruth Calder urged her to come to the pension and sit by the back window where she could slip out to the dock unseen, Clara agreed. The pension was a place of curt kindness, where the landlady took in trade for a bed and a watchful eye. The day Hank arrived, the air outside the pension was heavy, as if the cold had decided to attend the meeting. A bell over the street clanged, and men stopped on the sidewalk as if the sound alone might keep them honest. Then the door to the pension was pulled open, with a force meant to announce. Hank stepped in like a storm's attention, the kind of man who expected the world to answer to him. "Hank Blackwell," he said, voice like a ledger slammed down. His face was more rough-hewn in town than Clara remembered, his jaw set with the small cruelty of a man whose manners were his barometer. He looked at the room and the people in it as if they were items on a shelf. Clara felt the room tilt.
She had not meant to face him behind the pension's thin walls. She had thought she might keep her movements quiet and leave on the morning when the river opened. Now his presence rearranged the terms. Hank's eyes found hers like a man tracing an old ownership. "Clara Whitmore," he said, and his tone was a question that meant the answer must be yes. "You'd be better off coming home." She stood where she was by the window and put her hand on the revolver beneath her skirts. The motion was small and deliberate. The gun's weight against her palm was evidence, an argument, an assertion. "You don't get to tell me anything," she said, and her voice surprised her by carrying across the room. It had an iron in it that belonged to the new ledger she was trying to keep. Hank laughed. "You think you can run a ledger on me? I paid for things. You paid men to bring fear," she said. "You paid for hands that make sure women learn their place. That's not ledgers, Hank. That's theft of a person's life." The room spun with the electricity of other men's watching. Hank, pushed by pride and the small need to set the world straight, took a step toward her. He reached for a lamp on a side table and shattered it against the wall in a way that scattered oil and light. The motion was ugly, a thing meant to frighten. People drew back as if smoke would carry out a truth. There was a bright, short flare when the lamp hit, and the room smelled of scorched metal. Hank pushed his way across the floor with the inevitability of a man who assumed he owned the moment. He grabbed at Clara's sleeve, and his hand on her arm was the old thing, the possessive economy she'd paid to leave. But she was not the same woman who had stood under his shadow in their house. The thing she had learned on the road, in the cabin, and in the small kindnesses of others was not just how to survive, but how to answer a claim.
She pulled free, and then moved as if the motion had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Steady, practiced, a decision. Her hand came out from under her skirt, and the revolver was in it, like a thing that had been waiting to be acknowledged. She pointed it, not with fury, but with a flat, simple command. "Stop," she said. "Put your hands down." The room held its breath. Hank's face went red, then white. His men looked between him and the gun like gamblers catching the first bad card. For a long instant, the possibilities hung together like wet clothes on a line, tense and likely to snap. At the same time, the door to the pension burst open, and Cole moved in. He had the look of a man who smells trouble a mile away. He had tracked Hank's men through a tangle of routes and rolled in like a tide. He did not shout. He simply stepped and took a place near Clara with a posture that made it clear he would not be pushed. "Sheriff," someone called, and then a pair of deputies in town uniforms stepped through the doorway, having been warned by Mrs. Ruth's sheriff call. Wade Turner was not far behind them, the sight of his badge a slow, certain thing in the pocket of his coat. Hank's face cracked. The certainty that had lived in him for years met the hard, indifferent machinery of law. The sheriff's voice was clear and without theatrics. "Mr. Blackwell, you are under arrest for assault and disorderly conduct. There is probable cause." Hank's mouth worked like a trapped animal. "You've no right," he began. "You're coming with us," he interrupted. He placed his hand on Hank's shoulder with a motion that was not violent, but full of the right authority. "If you resist, that changes the charge." For a moment, Hank tried to make the room his argument. He reached for the pistol hanging at his hip as if to make one last claim. Clara's hand did not falter. She held the gun steady. Cole, without a show, stepped closer and placed his own hand near the barrel of Hank's gun. An old trick, the sort used by men who had wrestled more than arguments for a living. Hank's hand slackened, the weight of his choice pressing down. When the sheriff clapped iron on Hank's wrists, the room exhaled as if it had been holding a breath too long. Hank's hired men, faced with the law and with eyes that understood the room's new balance, did not put up a fight. They went silent, the kind of men who'd been paid to menace rather than to hold a legal argument. Clara's hands were shaking a little when she lowered the revolver. Her pulse was loud in her throat. People in the pension moved back to their life like a house that had been abated of a storm. Mrs. Ruth Calder appeared at Clara's side with a shawl and a quiet word about keeping warm. The sheriff spoke to her with a directness that bore no grand promises. "You did right," Wade Turner said. "You held your ground and you made cause. We can hold him here while we sort accounts." "That gives you time to get on a riverboat out of reach." "How long?" she asked again. The question sat with a hunger, not for the law, but for a certainty that would not come. "Long enough to get you to Canada if you choose to go," he said. "Long enough to put you aboard the Morning Star. But the law will still move slow on other matters. That's the truth of it." Clara accepted the truth as a woman who had learned how to prefer truth to fantasy. She had not asked the law for the whole of her life, only for a chance to set a line between what had been and what might be. The sheriff's hand rested on her shoulder,
not in a way that took possession, but in a way that was a human acknowledgement. They processed Hank at the sheriff's office with the necessary coldness of procedure. Witnesses were called: Mrs. Ruth, Mrs. Ellen, Cole, and a dock worker who'd seen the men coming. Clara gave her statement again, this time in the formal register required by law. The papers smelled of ink and order and the last of the town's patience. Hank thundered about injustice and made promises that were lawsuits for another day. His promises meant nothing in the sheriff's cold room. When the men were led away and the town settled into its ordinary rhythm, Clara felt a weary, small relief. The immediate danger had been met, but not all danger was gone. The people who'd been hired might yet return later, and the laws that followed were slow and brittle. For now, though, there was a rope to hold. The Morning Star's captain came to the pension to speak with Clara in low, honest tones. "She'll leave when she can," he said. "Could be a week, could be 3. Rivers are like women in this town, hard to read and easy to disappoint." Clara's world narrowed to a plan. She had to be aboard the Morning Star when the ice loosened. She had to make sure she had enough to pay and a place to go when she landed. Cole had done what he could to put money aside and to pay down the bribes and debts that kept men in Hank's pocket. He had, with the hard currency of his own life, bought her a chance. "You'll come?" she asked him once, sitting on the wharf with Rusty nearby and the river making slow, eternal lines. The thought of departure studied in her, an exit that was not a disappearance but a move toward a place where she could decide the shape of her days. "I'll come when I can," he said. "I have to finish some things here. There are men who will need more convincing. I won't leave you without a route." "You promised before," Clara said, "not as an accusation but as a measurement." "I promised." His face was plain, "and I'll keep it." When the day of departure arrived, the river had loosened enough to make the wharf a place of bustle, and the Morning Star's gangway was pinned with ropes and men who smelled of coal and salt. Captain Brooks watched Clara with a gruff benevolence, the sort that makes room for common decency.
He received her ticket, looked over the money Cole had arranged, and nodded as if a small plan had been completed. "You'll be watched on board," he said. "No one bothers you on my ship. You get a berth and a place at the table, nothing less." Clara had never expected the leaving to be easy. She stood on the gangway with the river running at her feet and the town a narrow line behind her. Cole had ridden in early that morning with Rusty and had a hard urgency about him. They stood facing each other in a moment that felt like a hinge between two lives. "You don't have to do what you did," she said. "I know," he answered. His voice was raw with a man's simple claim. "I won't stop doing it." They spoke then like two people taking inventory of a connection born in winter and danger. Words of grand promises would have been ridiculous. Instead, they drew in the small currency of what they could give. "Come when you can," she said. "I will. I'll follow on the first decent thaw. Maybe in weeks, maybe sooner. I got some debts to square. A man to speak to about those writers who came after you. I'll put down what I can, and I'll come north." He looked at her as if counting the hours between them. "If I didn't come, that's when you'd be right to burn the coat and forget the man who promised." Clara's thumb brushed the revolver at her hip, a reminder of the agency she'd chosen. Then she stepped forward and took him by the hand, an action with no hurry but full of permission. Their fingers found the shape of each other's life, as if measuring a promise that was both modest and huge. They kissed then, briefly, seriously, as if the gesture were a contract made without coercion, tied to a mutual will to return. "I'll be on that deck," Cole said. "If I'm late, don't wait. You go." "You don't have to say that," she said. A small laugh escaped her, half a sob, half a promise. He let go then, as if to give the world space to move. "Get on the boat, Whitmore," he said, an old kindness in a man's voice. "Get on the boat and be yourself." On board, the Morning Star smelled of hot coffee and tar and 100 small human economies. Clara took a berth that Captain Brooks had set aside and found a window where the river framed a moving line of ice and saw the town grow smaller. Cole remained on the wharf until the ropes were hoisted and the gangway drew up. He paced until the hull groaned, and then, like a man conceding to a schedule, mounted his horse and rode off along the river road away from the town and toward the tasks he'd promised. The ship's steam pulled them slowly from Fort Benton. Clara stood near the rail and watched the line of shore recede into a pale smear until the valley was a memory in grain and color. There was a quiet in her she could not have named then. It was not joy so much as relief, not safety so much as a new kind of claim. The ship's machinery hummed like a heart moving her further from Hank and closer to a life she could write.
The trip north was a slow, contemplative thing. Passengers kept to themselves. The crew minded their work with the attentive indifference of men who had learned to treat human life with a measure of dignity. Clara found herself sharing small meals with a cabin mate, a widow bound for relatives in the north, who told simple stories about gardens and the sweetness of spring when the ice gave up the river. The talk was small and human and felt like a balm. Weeks folded. Winter loosened its grip. Cole's absence was a pull that made the belly ache, but it did not hollow her out. She had made choices, and she kept them. Letters arrived, sparse, folded tight, the kind of paper with the cramped hand of a man who prefers not to waste ink. Cole wrote about small victories and about the men he'd found who had been paid to follow. He wrote about a debt settled and a rider who'd been told with very clear reasons not to touch a woman who'd been started by the sheriff's book. The letters were short, and their intervals were the kind of thing that built trust like bricks. Spring came as a slow, irrevocable thaw, days lengthening, river ice clinking and breaking like thin glass. Clara had a new life to weigh. Small savings, a modest room in a town beyond the border, and the sense that for the first time she might choose where to place her days. She wrote back in a careful hand about the small things she wanted for her future: a garden, a stove that didn't smoke, maybe a tenant room where a woman could rent out a cot and keep to herself. Her letters to Cole were not declarations, but extensions of the life she intended to keep. And then, on a day when the river was a running ribbon and the sky had the precise blue of early May, a rider rode into the town where Clara had taken a small room and turned down her papers. It was Cole, cheeks sunbrowned, hair a little longer, a scar near his mouth that had settled like a seam. Rusty's breath came in white puffs that had nothing to do with snow and everything to do with a rider's movement. He carried a parcel, small, wrapped in oilcloth, and wore the subtle, certain look of a man who had come to finish a beginning. They met where the road split toward the river and the green fields beyond. Clara, waiting with the careful patience she'd learned, felt the world press its hand to her chest and smile. When Cole dismounted, his fingers were steady, and his eyes had the kind of tenderness that isn't a grand gesture, but a daily habit. "You came," she said. "I told you I would," he said, and his voice had a private, soft thing in it. "I had some debts to square, men to put straight. I meant what I said. I don't break a promise to a woman who earns her life back." They stood then in the tall, thin spring grass, the town behind them, and the river calling in the distance. Their conversation was small and practical: where they might live, whether she wanted to keep her room for a few months, whether he would take work on a ranch for the summer. They spoke of a future that had options and inconveniences, and the clarity of two people who had earned the right to choose. Clara smiled in a way that had the shape of a woman who had survived and stepped into the ease of a decision. "I like the idea of a garden," she said, "and a stove that doesn't smoke." "We'll find both," Cole promised, as if he knew they would because he had already counted the hours. He reached for her hand and she took it, not because she lacked agency, but because she had chosen to share it. The months after were a slow, steady stitching together. They rented a small house on the edge of a town where the river cut a lazy turn and where neighbors liked to mind their own business. Clara planted a garden in a patch of soil that had been neglected. Cole worked with horses and hired himself for tasks that kept his days honest. They learned each other's quiet, the way Cole liked his coffee black and his stories short, the way Clara liked a window to be open to the morning. They learned to speak in gestures: a warmed blanket left by the stove, a hand placed with no urgency on an injured finger, a small parade of kindness in the shape of a stew to which neighbors were invited. Love between them was not thunder, but the settling of daylight. It was the practice of trust. Clara's agency stayed intact. She tended business, kept the revolver where she could reach it if need be, and spoke plainly when plans pressed. Cole made no claim to own what she'd rebuilt. Their affection was consent given repeatedly in the everyday: a touch at the base of a spine, shared bread, an agreement about the placement of a fence. Hank's legal shadow remained, as the sheriff had said, a slow-moving thing. There were court dates and men with papers who spoke of indictments and affidavits, but the immediate danger had been removed. The law had done what it could in a place where men with money had once owned more than land. Clara's life, once anchored to someone else's temper, became anchored to her own choices and to a man who had admitted fault to his past by the way he chose to act in the present. One warm evening in June, when the fireflies practiced their scattered lights and the air smelled of turned earth, Cole and Clara sat on their little porch and watched the day fold into a dark soft like a blanket. They had no great promises to exchange. They had instead a small, fierce gratitude for a life that no longer needed to be run from, but could be tended. "I think I'll plant more tomatoes next year," Clara said, and the statement was both plain and enormous. "I'll build a lean-to for the tools," Cole offered. They laughed in a steady way that was a promise made of small things. It was enough. The future did not come without its small alarms. Letters from time to time spoke of Hank's continued bluster, but his reach had been shortened by the sheriff's ledger and the small town's memory. The law moved, sometimes like a snail, but it moved. Most of all, Clara had a thing she had reclaimed, the right to voice a desire and to be listened to. Cole had given what he could without claiming the rest. They had, between them, made a life that resisted the old ledger of ownership. Years later, when they told the story in the low and careful way people tell such things, a caution against leverage and encouragement to keep small promises, they did not speak of dramatic last acts as though they were inevitable. They spoke of the longness, the running through snow, the steady hand of a sheriff, the small kindness of strangers, the resolute choices all along a road. They spoke of recovery as a practice, not a miracle, and of love as quiet labor. On some mornings, Clara would tie her apron and step outside to see the garden she had coaxed back to life, and Cole would be in the yard with hands that still bore the callus of rope and horses. They made room in their life for a tenderness that was not rescue, but a partnership of equals. They married one autumn with a small gathering, no fanfare, only neighbors who had watched the two keep their heads in the storms of the past. Ruth Calder, Mrs. Ellen Moore, and even Sheriff Wade Turner came, the last with his hat tipped and a small glen. Captain Brooks sent a parcel of dried goods as a joke about the river that had carried Clara to safety. Cole raised a glass to him in thanks. They never forgot the winter that had started it all. They kept small markers of that season as reminders. A coat patched at the sleeve that Clara now wore when she wanted to remember who had helped. A note in Cole's handwriting folded into a small trunk. The revolver rested in a drawer, primed not as a memory of fear, but as a reminder of the choice she had made and the agency she had held. The frontier remained a place of rough edges and uncertain law, and they respected the fact that not every story had an easy ending, but theirs had a shape not of rescue alone, but of mutual tending. They built a little house and planted tomatoes, and argued sometimes over the best way to mend a fence. They kept the people who had been kind near. Mrs. Ruth came to pat a cake now and then, the sheriff swung by with a friendly check, and Captain Brooks would find himself a chair on the porch when the river made him nostalgic. In the end, the title that had first shaped the story, Escaping a Violent Marriage, A Cowboy's Quest to Save Her in the Snow, was not a moral simplification, but a map of motion, a woman who ran and refused to be owned, a cowboy who answered a debt in the only way he could, by showing up, and a country that, in its best moments, gave room for people to make good of what had been broken.
They kept living in the way of people who had learned the economy of small mercies. When the harvest came, they sat down with neighbors and told the story without embellishment. Clara would look at Cole across the table and see the man who'd given his life back a shape of purpose. Cole would see in Clara a person who had never been merely his to save. She had been a life he had been entrusted to respect. Sometimes, when the light was right, Clara would stand at the garden's edge and look out across the river toward distant hills. The winter that had once tried to claim her became just a memory with a texture, white and relentless and necessary for what came after. She would breathe in the green air and the smell of earth, and for a moment she would taste the whole arc of a life that had moved from fear to choice to quiet love. If this story moved you, subscribe for more frontier rescues and true-hearted tales.